rye. So, there's some different terminology that happens there. Partially hydrogenated oil, or just hydrogenated oil. Sometimes it's pronounced hydrogenated. These are a type of oil that are man-made. Well, they take a regular oil, like say soybean oil, and then they chemically alter it so that it has a longer shelf life, and it will have a slightly different molecular structure, so that it doesn't behave the same way in our body. But these are known as trans fats. So, and I'm sure everyone has heard of trans fats before, but that's what when they're on an ingredient list, they're not called a trans fat. Like, you're not going to see trans soybean oil in the ingredient list. You're going to see hydrogenated soybean oil or partially hydrogenated soybean oil. The trans fat term is only used up in the nutrition fact panel, where it tells you how many grams of trans fat are in there. So it's kind of tricky wording. Again, that's another one of those things that happens. There's a lot that has to be learned sometimes just to be able to eat healthy. But what I typically tell people is, I know it's a lot to learn, but at the same time, if you just start eating more whole foods, you really don't have to worry about these things, because you're not eating the packaged items that have all these things in them. Canola oil and soybean oil both are very highly processed oils, and each of them have their own different problem that, from consumption of them. But one of the main problems with both of them is that they're refined oils, or it's kind of like, doing refined sugar or refined, like iodized salt. The nutrients are removed. There's a lot of heat that is used in the processing to get the oil out of the plant. And then to get it into the bottle, it requires a lot of chemical treatment, bleaching. There's just a lot that happens to these oils to where they end up becoming very damaged in the process of all of that. And then when we consume them, they become damaging to our body. One of the biggest ones that it was another big eye-opener for me was monosodium glutamate, or MSG. And I knew a lot of people had heard about MSG in relation to it being used in Chinese food. It's a type of seasoning, and it's known to be like a salt. They call it a seasoning salt. And it is known to be a flavor enhancer. It will enhance the flavor of whatever it is used in. And, studies have shown that what monosodium glutamate does is it's an excitatory compound. We call it an excitotoxin, because it excites the taste buds. So it makes you think the food tastes better than it actually does. But it also excites the neurons in the brain. And so it crosses through the blood-brain barrier, and then it kind of like does this constant firing of the neurons. So to the point where they're over responding all of the time. And that's what's kind of creating, like when you eat it and it's getting on your tongue, and then it's getting into the brain as well, it sends this signal to it kind of makes you want to continue eating. One, because it tastes good, but also two, because your brain is being stimulated like all the time. And so it's kind of hard for you to stop. It's kind of like one of those, it's almost like a chemical interference in your own, like, ability to stop. And it's so reproducible, this effect in the body, that researchers use it on purpose to do their research when they're trying to, if they want to make a rat eat more than it should, they give it some MSG, because they know that it will have that effect on them, because they do a lot of studies on obesity with mice. And so they need to get those mice obese. They're not born obese, they have to get them that way. So they give them MSG for that. Another thing that MSG does in the body is because of that neurological effect that's having, it also signals the pancreas to secrete 3 times more insulin than normal. And insulin is a fat storing hormone. When we have too high levels of insulin, it signals our body to store our excess carbohydrates as fat at a higher rate than normal, rather than using it for energy. And there have been studies showing that people who consume even just small amounts of MSG in their food tend to have a 30% higher risk of weight gain than those who don't consume it. And so it's basically been, clinically shown to induce obesity. And that is what they use it for, is to induce obesity or to induce diabetes in laboratory animals in order to be able to study the effects of obesity and diabetes. So we know it causes that, and yet it's still legal to be used in food. Aside from the fact that it causes, in some people it causes really bad headaches. People say that MSG headache feels like you have like a really tight band being tied around your head. It's a lot. So a number of other things here. Maltodextrin is oftentimes a monosodium glutamate in disguise. And we oftentimes find monosodium glutamate in artificial artificial flavors and something called natural flavoring. So, and by the way, I don't know if you knew this, but there's actually a difference between natural flavoring and natural flavor. It's really weird, but that's another little kind of loophole thing. We oftentimes find monosodium glutamate, since it's a seasoning. I mean, you can go down to a chef store or maybe even a regular grocery store and buy monosodium glutamate as a salt and use it in cooking. Some people still do that. And you'll see it show up on ingredient lists as well. But sometimes it hides in there because, now the food industry knows that people are becoming aware of this effect of monosodium glutamate, and they're trying to avoid it. And so the food manufacturers have a loophole. And that loophole is that if they're seasoning, like if you ever read an ingredient list, sometimes you just see the word seasoning, or you might just see the word natural flavor. And so what you don't realize is that that's a formula, and part of that formula is MSG. And the loophole for the food industry is if that formula has less than 79% of it is MSG, then they don't have to list MSG anywhere on the ingredient list. So you could have a food additive, some type of seasoning in your food that has 78% monosodium glutamate, and you wouldn't know it because it's not listed on there. It sometimes will show up under other names, though, like maltodextrin, for example. I always say anything with a number after it probably is something we shouldn't be consuming. And I added sodium lauryl sulfate down here because that was the degreaser that was in my angel food cake mix. You'll find sodium lauryl sulfate usually as it's a whipping aid. So you find it in products that have like dried eggs or things that like need to get really fluffy. So that's where you typically will find it, in those types of foods. And not to mention it's also in soaps, different types of soaps. I discovered that in high concentration, you'll find it in garage floor cleaner as well. So it didn't give me a great feeling to know that that was in my food. So here's some other names of things